So today I want to talk about React's use callback hook and why it's important and why do we need this in our functional components. But before I start on it, I wanted to go back a bit into history of what we actually used to do in our class components and what has happened in our functional components and where does React use callback come in place. So I have an example here, which is a class and a functional component. Both are the same components implemented in different styles. One is a class-based approach and the other is a functional-based approach. So let's talk about the class-based approach first. It's very simple. So what we have here right now is a simple class example. It has a state for increment. The initial increment is 0. But when you click on this button increase, increment it will increase the increment count one by one. It's just a simple p tag, and on our onClick we call this method here. Now what happens is every time our state updates, this random method is going to get called again. Every time a random method gets called again, so imagine it's reading from top to bottom. By the time it comes to this button at the onClick method, it's going to assign a new reference for the same function for this thing, because we're saying, okay, every time we render, come in the onClick method and see we have another function which calls another function here. So every time we click on this increase button, it's going to pass in a new reference for this onset increment function. Now, a good way what we can do is, I'll just comment this out as not a good approach. And what I'll do is I'll just pass in a direct reference here. So now every time I click on the increase button and my increment count increases and this render method is called on every state update, it's going to pass in the same reference of this onset increment function, and it's not going to have a new reference for this function again. Now, if I come to my functional component and I'll just click this, I'll even set this to function. You can ignore this file. Okay, so this is the same function. First of all, look at this. This is just beautiful. When the React team came out with these functional components, with these hooks, I was like, what? Why do we have that? Classes are so beautiful. But now that I've started writing in these functional components, I'm not going back. So it's the same thing. The only difference is it says function here and it's implemented as a functional component. So we have an onset increment function, which is used here in the onClick handler. Now, the only difference here is every time we updated our state in our class components, only this part was executed again on every state change, or those specific lifecycle methods like should component update and uh, those life cycles like that. But with functional components, every time I update my state, it's going to call this thing all over again. But React is smart enough to know that it will maintain the history of a particular state. But if it's calling this again, and by the time it reaches here on every increase count for this functional component, it's going to assign a new reference here. Although we're not doing something like this, we're not absolutely not doing anything like this, which here works as well. Even if I do something like this, every time I update my state, it's going to call this entire block of code again, everything that's inside this functional example component. And when I do that, it's going to assign a new reference for the same function again, which is something that I don't want. So what I can do is I can comment this thing out and I can do on set increment and I can do React.useCallback. And now it's the same thing, but every time we update our state with the increment count and this entire piece of code is executed, the onClick method receives the same reference to this onset increment function, unless or until anything in this array dependency changes, which is not changing right now. But yeah, this is the only so this is what callback does. And even if we go here, this is a bit confusing because it says memoize callback and pass an inline callback and an array of dependencies use callback will return a memoized version of the callback. See, a memoized version of the callback. And I think for me, the first time I read it, I thought that this was returning me a memoized function value, which is not what it does. If you want to use that, you have to use React memo for that. But if you want to memoize a callback for a function, you have to use this. I hope this was helpful. And uh, yeah, if you find this helpful, do leave a comment or reach out to me on Twitter.